To all the people who said lesbians can't have children, I don't think that's the message of the show. And also, it's 2080. They probably can.
Yeah, on their own, just like asexually, like reproduce. That would be awesome.
Like Morrissey.
Don't need men for anything anymore. Okay.
Hi, folks. This is Louis Herfin, the original Peter Abernathy. Hell is empty and all the devils are here on the Shat TV Westworld podcast with Roger, Gene, and Big D.
Welcome back to Shat on TV Westworld, the unofficial podcast companion piece to the hit HBO series Westworld. I am one of your hosts, Gene Lyons, and alongside me is my co-host, Ash.
Hi, y'all.
Big D has the night off tonight because he turned 49.
Yeah. Happy birthday, Big D.
And this is our deep dive edition where we look back on this week's episode of Westworld and provide our thoughts and analysis 24 hours after watching the season finale for Westworld. This week's episode was titled Sera Sera. It was season 4, episode 8. Ash, how are you feeling about it today?
Yeah, I rewatched it this morning before work, and I was hoping that I would find some quote-unquote beauty in the episode, and I didn't. I think it was a pretty disappointing season finale, and if this is the end, which a lot of people online are like, did they change the plot line up because they realized they were getting canceled? This is a really disappointing series finale, and I just want to say I cannot wait for the Telegraph this week because all you people out there that were like, Ashley's negative, Gene's negative, they hate this show. There are currently 111 comments on YouTube for our Instacast, which is like double what we normally have by this time. And there is only one out of the 111 that is a positive comment. So I'm feeling like I'm amongst my people again.
Now, for those of you diehards who are still into Westworld, don't fret.
No.
We're not going to be fully negative on this deep dive. We are going to get into what we saw on screen because there was still a lot to go through, a lot to sift through, a lot of what it means for season 5. So the key topics we're going to focus on tonight are what actually happened in the episode, what identity means and what being alive means as we dove deeper into it in episode 8. The body count that we saw in this episode was extraordinary. A lot of key characters died off. So we're going to go through just so we have a tally of everybody who died and then who's left on the planet as we exit season 4. We'll get into the final test that Christina is setting up, what that might look like as it takes us back to Sweetwater. A few loose ends that the series left dangling there, especially in the event that we don't get a season 5. What is left unanswered, and then finally some odds and ends that didn't quite fit neatly into any category. And if you'd like to get in for our Telegraph, which comes out on Friday, please go ahead and send us an email, host@shatontv.com. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode and the season overall. Or you can go to shatpod.com/TV and leave us a SpeakPipe message. We love the ones we've gotten so far. We look forward to getting even more after you hear this deep dive. But Ash, let's start with what actually happened in this episode. A lot of times we get ahead of ourselves and get really deep into the philosophy and don't bother to step back and say, what do we actually see on screen?
Yeah, so I mentioned on the Instacast that so many reveals came so quickly in that kind of like Return of the King multiple ending episode that we wanted to really break down like, okay, what were these actual reveals? The first thing is that everybody's fucked. Like that is the big reveal, is that the humans didn't win, the host didn't win, everybody's screwed. That is a surprising end for some people and a satisfying end for some people. Humans, thanks to the tower, are wiping each other out. Hosts are either committing suicide or being killed by all of these humans that are turned to rage mode, or they're going to end soon because of failed fidelity testing like Caleb. And I do think that this is an interesting switch up than what a lot of people assumed would happen, which is that there would be some, delineation of like winner loser at the end of this season as there have been previously.
I fit squarely in the satisfied camp. When Bernard kind of previewed this outcome, when he said that there's no avoiding the extinction event, but there was a path, possibly, I think he made it more of a question of something versus nothing instead of host versus human. And I really liked that view of the show. It went a different way from what we're used to seeing in TV, which is like you got the good guys and the bad guys, and they may be a little blurry about who's good and who's bad, but eventually some side wins. In this case, everybody loses, but there might be a path forward for sentience.
For once, this is a shared world. It's not an equitable world where they have equal power, but it is shared, where they're living amongst each other in fairly large numbers in each group. And I do think that that is a place we didn't expect to get to from the parks to now. And I think that that's interesting.
For those listeners in the UK, in the United States, we do say sentience.
Yeah.
I apologize if that's grating to your ears.
Instead of sentient.
Sentient.
Yeah, we do say sentient. We break up the syllables.
We fought a war over it.
So the other thing that we learned in this episode is that we thought Rehoboam had deleted all that was Dolores at the end of season 3. And this was a really tragic death that a lot of us mourned because it was a death that we didn't think that she could come back from. You know, we've seen hosts like Maeve and hosts like Bernard get shot and get maimed, but they can be remade. Well, when you're wiped, you know, there's no way for an electronic thing to come back from that. But we found out that Rehoboam wasn't quite so good at the wiping because somehow Dolores still is there. And somehow Dolores got this pearl, saved it. And not only did she save it, she used it to run the heart of the tower that controlled this new world order, where Dolores was rewritten as Christina, who was in charge of rewriting basically everything in this new world. And here's the thing, when I joke about the wiping, we know that she wasn't totally blank slate because the way that Christina breaks out is she rebuilds people like Teddy completely from memory. And she even talks about how he's been so ingrained and so important to her life that she could remake every part of him just from those memories. And she wouldn't have those memories if she had been wiped clean. So I have questions, you know, what exactly did Rehoboam actually do to Dolores? Like, if anyone out there knows, that would be great to hear about, because I really think this redoes what was a very satisfying character death in season 3. Probably the only thing about season 3 that I liked was the way that Dolores went out, this beautiful sacrificial way that felt like a neat closure that wasn't a closure at all.
And don't mistake what Ash is saying for us not understanding what the show is trying to tell us. It's more like, if wiping a host is not death for them, then what, we have to actually see that pearl crumble? And even then, are they dead, or someone can just remember them and then they come back? And if they do, why do they have memories of everything from before? Because I think what the show is telling us is Rehoboam did wipe out Dolores Prime, but her base code as the first host is probably the most easily replicated and the purest distillation of what the hosts are. So essentially, Hale took the base code and then used that to create other hosts, and then left like an unmolested version of that for the role of the storyteller, the pearl that's in the tower. Or possibly that she just rolled back to a version of herself before all the calamity that befell her and was like, oh, that's pure Dolores. Let's make a Christina out of that. And that's sort of a bittersweet notion, but this is an elaborate setup by Serac and Rehoboam with all these wires connected to her for the sole purpose of completely wiping her out. Just honor that death. And Lisa Joy has said in interviews that some deaths must be honored. If not this death, then which?
If it's her original source code, I don't know how the memories would come from it, because it's not just Teddy, it's Peter, it's all these different things that she pulls and remakes from her own experience. And then a pure version of Dolores, I loved Dolores's character arc, where she goes from this horribly abused figure by all of these men around her to being this very empowered woman. And the way she goes, and we actually see her be so angry and want revenge in 2 to really being on the side of like good in season 3, that arc was earned. And who Dolores became was a really fantastic, complex protagonist that we don't get a lot of the time. And I know here comes a one wipe review, but we don't get a lot of the time with female characters on television shows. And she's not just like the angry bitch. She's angry for a reason. She's afraid of men for a reason, but she comes through it and she comes out the other side better as a result of it. So it's not even just about honoring her death. It's about honoring her journey. So I'm hoping that that Dolores at the end in that blue prairie dress is the Dolores that went through all of that. Otherwise, I don't want Dolores back.
Rehoboam, not so good at wiping.
No, Rehoboam sucks at wiping. The other thing that we wanted to just make sure we review is we've talked about timelines. Timelines is always a big topic with Westworld. What's happening and when is it happening? And we get evidence for sure here that Dolores and Dolores are in parallel timelines. One is in a computer, one is in the quote unquote real world, but they're existing alongside each other, which of course puts to rest the question of whether or not Caleb ran by Christina in that one episode. He didn't because she was in a computer. And within this timeline, we know that Dolores left herself a maze for Christina. And guys, this is another example of memory. She had to have somewhere deep-seated in her code the memory that Ford woke her up this way. And this was the one reveal I liked. I was really glad it wasn't Teddy Flood that was leaving her the mazes. I would have thrown up if it were Charlotte Hale that were leaving her the mazes, or if Bernard somehow like was secretly like in every iteration of, you know, his review in the Sublime was somehow like sending her these mazes. I love the fact that Dolores knew this in her memory. She left it for herself so that she's woken up again. And she was, and so much so, not only was she woken up, but she ends up back where it all began in Sweetwater, which that piece of it I think is very satisfying.
For most Westworld viewers, I think episode 7 made it settled case law that Christina's augmented reality existence went poof when the tower went haywire. And in fact, she did not really exist in that world. So Denise, if you're listening out there, I think you're the only one still questioning it. She was not in the real world. Sorry.
Well, the final thing for this part is really more a question from me to the audience, because this is, with all the reveals, the one piece that I've not been able to make peace with. And that is the weird ass coffee date that Hale and Christina have. This is the one part that doesn't make sense to me. Because we can suppose here that the reason why Hale was so upset about Christina seeing someone, which we knew was Teddy, is that Christina wasn't supposed to be seeing anybody because she was on a loop. She was supposed to be by herself. She wasn't supposed to have a roommate. She wasn't supposed to have dates. She was supposed to be in isolation. And I am confused as to why Hale, when she realizes she's not, which clearly she does, why she doesn't react to it more. She had to have known that this meant something was very wrong. And I just need to know why Hale didn't move on it. Like, why didn't she Godzilla march her then? Why did she wait for her whole world to fall apart?
I think the Godzilla march, while violent and cartoonish, wasn't punishment for Christina going astray or any sort of overreaction. I saw it as a surprise coronation and emergence from exile. Hale wasn't like trying to stomp out Christina or rob her of her existence, but rather she was freeing her from her cage and carrying her to the Sublime to be the new god. So perhaps in seeing her go off her loop, Hale was a bit concerned, but at the same time almost happy for her, if that's possible.
Yeah, but why did she not worry about her messing with all of those stories? I mean, it just, I don't know. Hale was such a control freak. It just seems
that's true,
odd and out of character for her to just be like,
well, I think Hale was struggling with a lot of stuff in this season. And, you know, several characters in the season finale wrestled with identity and what it is to be alive. And through them, I think Westworld seemed to present myriad viewpoints on these questions. So let's start with Christina, since we left off with Christina. Through Teddy, Christina convinces herself she's alive, right? So she's speaking to herself through this avatar that is Teddy. And she calls herself a machine without a body. And I feel like this Christina character might be there to humanize possibly other entities like Rehoboam, which she, of course, killed. But is Christina a distinct entity? Like, right, does she exist on her own? She's brought back Teddy from Dolores' memory. She's wearing Dolores' clothes. And in flashback scenes in the season finale, Christina seems to recall her prior identity, as you were talking about, Ash. She's not wiped out. So she has an identity, but it isn't completely new. So the question really is she Dolores? Is she Dolores' child in the way that we would understand what a host's child would be? Something that's spawned off from your code, that has some of your generational memory, but is something else? Or is she truly something else distinctly and is just leaning on Dolores because she has no other identity to cling to? Because she can process information and make decisions. We see that. But does that make her a living being?
So a couple of things. I think that this complicates Westworld's question of what does it mean to be alive? And I think they're playing with the idea that consciousness is without form. It is something that exists but doesn't need a form in which to exist. And so it's very similar to what I would think like the human concept of a soul is, that there can be this thing that is representative of who you are and contains all of your downloaded information. But once your body dies, that leaves and goes someplace else. And so I think that they're showing that there's this equitability here in terms of like hosts are data, humans are data, and they don't need a body in order to exist. Now, what is she? I would love to think that we're getting something as complex as the questions you're asking. I think they're beautiful. I think this would be a beautiful show. But I think they showed us her pearl for a reason. And that this episode, a lot of the reviews that I read, everybody was like, this was so much more straightforward than we were expecting. This was such a straightforward finale. And I'm thinking that they intended it to be that way, that it is straightforward, that somehow Dolores got her pearl and the pearl is her and this is Dolores. As much as Dolores is Dolores, this is Dolores. It's just a Dolores that isn't all, got a crispy arm.
I think we kind of giggled when Hale offed herself. And the effects look pretty cool, but I don't think the Westworld writing room was going for giggles when it dreamed up Hale taking herself offline. So I want to dig into that decision, right? It also has to do with identity and being alive. Hale's decision to save the Sublime and free Christina had to come from somewhere. I'm guessing that somewhere also is the origin of her decision to kill herself. It's like a vampire going out for a sunrise stroll. And I think Hale's suicide ironically mirrors the suicide of so many hosts before her, right? She was concerned about all these hosts killing themselves. In the end, she ends up being a host that killed herself. And she gives her reasoning in this episode for what she's been doing, right? I thought if I made a world perfect enough, they, being the host and the Sublime, would come back. She knows she's damaged goods. She knows there's no path forward and she doesn't have a place in the Sublime. So she just decides to die. Now, personally, me, I'd be like, listen, I could potentially live forever. I got a lot of making up to do for some pretty gnarly shit that I've done. Personally, I'd become guardian of the dam. But, whatever, it's her choice.
The biggest 180 for me isn't bad mustache twirling villain to hero, right? It isn't that. It's that I truly believe at her core, she wanted these hosts from the Sublime to come back. Like she had the best of intention. She wanted to create a world for them. And what I find confusing is that she's leaving the Sublime so unprotected. Like I would think she would wait to off herself until Dolores Prime has figured it out and the experiment, that she's given her this chance. You would think that she would wait around to see what that chance was. Now, do I think that the inevitability of her not choosing not to exist in this world, I think that's an inevitable thing for Hale, because I think Hale realizes that she is an aberration because of the fact that she is corrupted code because of these things that she went through. So I have no problem with that. It just, like everything else in this episode, felt like, well, we want her to kill herself eventually, and we may not have a season 5, so we're going to go ahead and have her kill herself now. And that's a bummer, because this could have been so powerful if she had waited and protected and ended up, with the Sublime being protected because of her and then killing herself. That would have been powerful. It's a bummer that this is the way I feel like this character went out.
You're absolutely right, because I didn't feel anything when she
Right.
did it, and it would have been nice to feel something. And of all the farewells and dramatic speeches that were supposed to give me feels in this season finale, I think Caleb's was the only one that really got me choked up. And I'm not talking bawling on the couch. I'm talking like minor chokes. Here's a guy who's died hundreds of agonizing deaths just to see his daughter again. He knows he's terminally broken and he accepts it. What I really loved about Caleb is that he owned his identity. He tells Frankie that her father's been dead for 23 years. He's this revenant. He's a revenant machine and arguably the bravest character of the season. And if they could have built more characters like that acknowledged what they were, I would have been possibly more invested in their deaths.
Yeah, I mean, this was the only death that felt like a sacrifice for me in this episode. And I don't know if it was an earned sacrifice, because I do think the buildup to it was weak, but I like the fact that he remained a father to the end. That was the best thing they did to his character, is that they gave him a daughter to make him more human, to make him parallel to Maeve. And the same way that Maeve sacrificed herself for her daughter, Caleb truly is sacrificing himself for his daughter. And the hardest thing as a parent is to know that eventually your children will have to exist in the world without you. And so like I tell Finn all the time, because he asks questions like, well, I don't understand why I have to do that. Why do I have to make eye contact with people that I don't know? Why do I have to, be polite? And I tell him all the time, because one day I'm not going to be here to show you how to exist in the world. And so you have to know how to exist in the world. That's my number one job, is to make sure you know how to navigate the world around you. That's what Caleb is doing here. He's being the ultimate parent in this end by saying, you've lived without me and you're going to continue to live without me. And this was just a flash in time that, if you get too hung up on, will like steer you off track, right? Like, she doesn't exist in a world where sentimentality can exist. Sentimentality causes death in the type of world that she lives in. And so I did like that about their farewell. And I think Frankie took it well, because she, I think, understood, because she is his daughter, what he was doing, and understood the sacrifice he was making for her.
Now, in contrast, host William is on the opposite side of the spectrum from Caleb, right? We know he hasn't passed fidelity because he isn't falling apart the way Caleb is. So he's less William than Caleb is Caleb. But he sees himself as the real deal, and he's making a pretty strong argument for that. He tells Hale, I am William, and explains William didn't die, he evolved. Apparently, that evolution came with the side effect of losing his shooting skills. But it presents a question that might be answered in season 5. I hope there is a season 5. I hope this question gets answered. Is a creature evolved still that creature? I'm not the person I was as a child. I'm a different thing entirely. But am I still me? If an entity as a part of its growth cycle is digitized, is it not still itself? Like, is this William or is it not?
I think it's like asking, is like Windows 98 the same thing as Windows today, right? Like
Thank God, no.
Like they don't look a whole lot alike, but they have that same source code. And I think it's the same way that you see people and they're like, oh, but you were such a happy child, and then they go on to like struggle with depression or, addiction or things like that. And so I think that that's what you're seeing here. But I think that the interesting thing that could have been done with William's character is we're seeing what happens when a human is remade into a host, and the loop is its dominant personality trait. William's dominant personality trait is anger, right? It's anger and revenge and cruelty. That is what made him him. And we know that the mask was what Delos saw, like when he was like the head of the company and at cocktail parties. That wasn't who he was. These things defined him. And I think, and we've talked about this before in the show, or it could be Movie Pod. They all run together for me. But at some point in our podcasting together, we've talked about how we all have like a dominant flaw and we all have a dominant positive trait. And they're usually deeply interrelated. So like my dominant flaw is that I allow myself to get walked all over. Like I do way too much for people because I have such empathy for people. Like I know people say I'm cold and heartless, but I'm really not. Like I have such an overt amount of empathy sometimes for people that I overextend myself and get walked all over. But the flip side of that is that I've got a beautiful empathy that exists for people, and therefore it makes me very good at my job and what I do. And I think that that's what's interesting about these hosts is you've got William, who the great side of him is how calculating he is. He's brilliant. He's smart. He knows what to do at all times. But the flip side of that is that calculation is cruel, usually. The flip side of that is the cruelty from it. And that, I think, is a really fascinating idea, is because the complexity of human nature isn't there when you just take our dominant traits. Because human nature makes us trim those, and we don't show them to the world. We put on another face because of human nature and because of morality. And when hosts aren't given that and they're only given those dominant traits, you're really setting everyone up for failure. And maybe that's why these hosts that Charlotte was making are coming into this world and killing humans and having issues and winding up killing themselves, because they aren't human. They're a reflection of humanity, but they don't have the morality that makes people human.
So let's move on to the body count in this episode. So we saw a lot of characters get killed off. I want to do a quick rundown of everybody that we saw die, how they died. So Charloris, we already talked about. Tessa Thompson really wore out her welcome, I think, this season. I'm not at all sad to see this character go. I would have been satisfied if she just got capped in episode 7 and that was it. Maeve was shot by William in the head with no drone host to revive her. This one is probably one of the more upsetting ones for me, just because I expected more out of the character. And we're hearing a lot of that. We'll get into it in the Telegraph, where people were really upset that her character didn't go anywhere after being brought back.
Well, and I want to give a shout out to Black Women Rising Daily, who reached out to me on Twitter with a question about like Maeve and Bernard, which I know you're going to get to in just a second. She's not alone. She's not in isolation here. That like Charloris, Maeve, and Bernard all are killed and aren't coming back, and they're all like the three like hosts of color, right, in the show. And then you've got Dolores, who is coming back, and Teddy Flood's back, and all of this. And there are a lot of people who are criticizing like that Maeve and Bernard just kind of died as like offshoots in the last couple of episodes. And if you think about it, Maeve, she gave up eternity with her daughter like for this. I think a lot of that's suspect there. And I don't think the show's doing anything intentionally to try to make a point. I just think it's kind of ick on face value and a real bummer, because Maeve and Bernard deserved a lot fucking better. Charloris, I mean, hopefully Black Women Rising Daily agrees with me. Charloris, regardless of her, she needed to go because Tessa Thompson was just really not doing a great job. But Maeve and Bernard, it's a bummer.
Not to mention Uwade, who just died off screen.
Yes!
Like, oh yeah, and her too, cancer. So make it 4, I guess.
She's gone.
Speaking of Bernard, he was shot by William with no drone host to revive him. You'd think Hale, after watching the video message, is like, well, fuck, I better bring Bernard back. He was just trying to do his best. I forgive him. Maybe he can help me out. Maybe we'll go to the dam together. Stubbs, meanwhile, gets impaled on a drugstore rack by Clementine. And a lot of people thought this was an undignified ending for Ashley Stubbs. But this dude's gotten plenty of plot armor throughout the seasons. And did we ever find out how he repaired himself between seasons 3 and 4? He's in a bathtub, like rotting away. Season 4, he's like, I'm good.
It was all those tuna melts.
I guess so. Clementine was shot in the head by Frankie, and sure, it built up some suspense, that whole scene, but like she was crouched right in front of Frankie. Couldn't Frankie just shoot her right in the face when she was talking shit?
Yeah, this was so much less cool than blowing up the data room.
And finally, there's William. I always want more Man in Black, and I can't see HBO letting Ed Harris off the payroll for season 5. But if this really was the end for William, getting shot by the Chekhoviest of guns feels like a real downer. You talk about how William was always calculating, always playing the cards right. This guy walked down a tunnel and just stood there. Why was he chasing Hale anyway?
I don't know, but I could not help but think the same thing. Like when he was like, reach out to your left, it's like, oh, fuck, this is not just Chekhov's gun. This is like Chekhov's like, I'm going to tell you where the gun is ahead of time to foreshadow that it's Chekhov's gun. Like, ugh. It was hilarious. I mean, it was really funny.
Hey, there's a gun hidden in the tunnel.
Right.
Behind the pipes.
Reach to your left. Well, you've gone through the body count. So that brings us to this next topic, which is like, so who the fuck is left, right? And so the first thing here I want to talk about is a little bit of a satisfying irony that I do genuinely find satisfying about this season, which is I love the idea that humans create hosts, humans abuse hosts then get pissed off and a host eventually kills all humans. Like, that's great. Clearly, the humans that are infected, so let's call them the fly humans. The fly humans, not meaning like cool as in fly, like literally like, bzz, I'm infected fly, that those humans are going to fight themselves into extinction, thanks to the failsafe that MIB put into place. So the infected humans, they're all done. I think we can all agree upon that. But that leaves the uninfected humans. And so someone posted on YouTube, and I so apologize for not writing down your name, but posted that it was this podcast's theory that the outliers died. But I went back and rewatched, and Dolores very clearly says in her voiceover, some may last days, some may last weeks, but eventually they're all gone. They're all going to be extinct. To that person's point, clearly there are at least 2 humans left on this planet that are uninfected. We have to assume that there's others that are living out there in the condemned lands. But what are they doing, right? And we talked about this on the Instacast, like how are they wiped out? And for me, this part of the show felt very much like the ending of a zombie movie in a lot of ways. Like the humans are going to be overrun by a host of rage-infected people. So perhaps eventually they're wiped out by those that are left behind, like in a zombie film. But I'm unsure. And you asked me, Gene, on the Instacast, would I want an answer to that? And yeah, I guess I would. I mean, I don't like have to have it, but it would be nice to know.
I just hope that boat arrives safely in Nevada.
Yeah, me too. They got to go all the way around.
I like the additional twist that hosts maybe don't actually have to kill all the humans. Like humans will just die out. And I started thinking about the Neanderthals, right? There's all these juicy explanations about how they were wiped out, like Homo sapiens killed them off or fucked them into oblivion or whatever it was. But it's quite possible, and several scientists agree, that the numbers of the species and their geographic distribution just couldn't stand up to fizzling out by natural causes, basically, right? And any one given time, I think they were only in pockets of about 10,000, which could wipe out if there's any sort of a shortage of food, water, bad weather, whatever. And maybe there just aren't enough humans and they aren't close enough together to make it work for a future generation. And they just die out. And to all the people who said lesbians can't have children, I don't think that's the message of the show. And also it's 2080, they probably can.
So, and then there are the hosts. Like, we know that Bernard tells Maeve that both of the races are wiped out. And just like the creation of the human race, the hosts themselves ultimately destroy the human race. Here we've got the creation of a host ushering in the host destruction, with Dolores building out the host in black. I think that we see with that conversation of the 2 Ed heresies, that clearly William thought that hosts were becoming too much like humans, so he seeks to end them. But we do have pearls left, and we have the ability to resurrect pearls in a way that we can't with humans, and Bernard's body's just laying there, and Maeve's is just laying there getting waterlogged, and Stubbs is just laying there. So you could believe that Dolores and whatever she's doing could come and resurrect these people that she wants to. So I'm quite sure we will see some of our nearest and dearest end up with Dolores and Sweetwater come season 5.
So let's talk about what we can expect to see in season 5, if there is one, right? We've heard about this final test. That's how they close out this entire season. Christina has been chosen to administer a final test to determine survival or extinction for sentience on Earth. We got to ask why her, and we got to ask what the test will be. As you said, Ash, in the episode, the voiceover says, ultimately, their kind will go extinct, referring to humans. They will only live as long as the last creature that remembers them, and that creature is me. And then she raised her fist to the sky and flies off screen. Now, Tom from Chicago wrote in and said, one of the themes for this season was the fact that all sentient life forms, biological and non-biological, will face a great filter. So let's see Christina as the great filter. The test is that great filter. The concept of the great filter is a solution to the Fermi paradox. So the Fermi paradox, if you're not familiar, is that question of if the universe is in theoretical probability teeming with life, why have we not encountered it? Why can't we see it? And the solution to that question is the great filter, which says that all sentient life faces an existential crisis during its development that can result in its destruction. And so eventually they do. We just happen to have not fallen prey to the Great Filter yet. For example, an inability to manage nuclear power, environmental mismanagement, and in the case of the Westworld world, an inability to control AI. As such, few, if any, sentient life civilizations are able to pass the Great Filter test. And again, this could be tied into our nature at the end of the day being more powerful than our nurture, which is a question that Westworld has asked. Listener Todd B wrote in and tied that to the myth of the maze, right? So in the earlier seasons, we talked about the myth of the maze. And in that myth, there is the man who crawled his way back from death countless times to eventually build a home at the center of a maze. The maze being the measure of a person's life. Todd's saying this seems super prophetic with what we're seeing with Dolores, especially now that she's been reborn in her rancher's daughter, natural splendor, love, and self, right? It seems like an augury foretold by an advanced predictive algorithm. It's sketch either way, he says. So based on these two opinions, and thank you guys for writing in, you helped me so much on this episode. My best guess is Christina is designing a maze for the humans whose data has been collected and who now will ultimately be deemed worthy or unworthy of life in the sublime. And that would explain why Bernard scans Frankie in the mirror at Prohibition World. And it also leaves the door open for characters like Caleb and like William to resurface in season 5. The writers were pretty smart here, actually, because they've given themselves permission to make season 5 like an all-star game of Westworld seasons, right? You could take the favorite characters, the best characters from all the previous seasons and bring them back and you don't have to explain it. And you get to have it all inside the most popular set, which is the original park. This allows them to bend all the rules.
I will be interested to see how they avoid this just being Dolores playing God in the same way that Ford did. I think they're going to have to navigate that because otherwise we're back where we started with the issues with Ford, why Arnold rejected what was happening in the experiments. Like if Dolores is basically deciding heaven or non-existence because it's like Sublime or Oblivion, I think that that's going to be a very difficult, like, moral paradox for them to tackle next season.
What we might see is Dolores sort of playing an uncaring god or some sort of a Taoist view of Sweetwater, right? We could find ourselves in a digital reproduction of the original park and humans work their way through a type of maze that could get really out there with the mysteries. I think it'd be really satisfying if we saw people working through their shit and kind of broke from the formula, right? That Dolores isn't sitting there pulling the strings or even showing up necessarily. And instead, it's just humans working through their shit. Remember that seasons 1 through 4 all essentially happen in the real world. We get some scenes occurring in a simulation, but most of them are in the real world. So we're bound by reality. Yes, it's the future. Yes, it's sci-fi, but there's still basic rules that apply. You go into the Sublime and any supernatural occurrence or breach of logic would be okay. I mean, in Christina's world, we have no idea what the rules are, which could be deliciously enigmatic and very strange. And I wonder if that's what we're seeing at the end of season 2. One of the things lots of people have asked about is what the fuck was that all about at the end of season 2? When we saw the man in black, going through those loops. There's that scene with William and Emily in a long abandoned Westworld. And are they ever going to get back to that? Maybe they have. I mean, Emily's long gone in this scene. We know now that William is dead. Were we getting a sneak peek at Christina's test more than 4 years ago? That would be some clever planning on the part of Westworld if it's true.
That would be badass. I agree with you.
And while we might have wrapped up that loose end, possibly, there are several that this season kind of left dangling there. Ash, you'd brought up the surviving hosts. In the event that hosts aren't wiped out by humans, like, what do they do now? I don't think Christina's game is built for them. And I wonder if they're just roaming around repeating their catchphrases from season 1, walking around New York.
That's a really sad concept for me, that these like very intelligent beings that are, just like how kids don't ask to be born, they didn't ask to be made. Like the idea of them not knowing what to do because there's no one to drive them on their loop. That's really depressing.
And you'd think that Hale, in trying to make a world that was like safe for hosts, wouldn't have put so many firearms in New York City or made them able to hurt the hosts. I was kind of surprised in that Rebus scene when they're saying, hey, they're all going to find us and wipe us out, that there's millions of them and only a few of us, referring to the humans. that kind of explain that they're likely to die out, but it's nothing for sure. I also got to ask why Maeve was so important. If she comes back in season 5 and plays a huge role, fine. Maeve can be the weapon, but it's all based on Christina's memories anyway. Like season 5 could have a Maeve without Maeve being dug up. You didn't need to dig her ass up. And we don't even know if we get a season 5. So basically, people's worst fears came true. Her job was to fight Hale until William shot them both. And that's it.
Yeah, she got done dirty. I think, everybody's complaining about Stubbs, but Maeve deserves so much better than the way she went out.
And another loose end is the cause. I understand that humans are all going to die out, according to the voiceover, but the cause was there. They were waiting, I assume, to save the world. You've got a battle for human survival. Where were they? Why didn't they fight harder? I mean, they've got weapons, they've got training. What the fuck were they doing? Were they waiting for another opportunity? It's like Westworld just kept forgetting to address the notion that the rest of the world exists. It was like just New York and the dam. And isn't that the whole point of taking the show out of the park, is to bring the world into the show? And I feel like they failed. I mean, there's a whole America, there's a whole world, there's other countries. What's going on?
Yeah, we still didn't get our answer of whether or not there's multiple towers, right? And did William corrupt all the towers? I mean, so many questions, which somebody made fun of me on YouTube for saying, but guys, I don't know what else to say. Like, I have questions.
And it's not like we need everything explained to us. It's more like, why introduce it in the first place?
Right.
You show us this thing and then you just stop telling us about it. And we're left wondering what the hell happened. When Bernard scans Frankie, I can only assume that he scanned her so we can see her in the Sublime with Caleb. But then isn't Bernard kind of a dick because he doesn't scan her girlfriend? And also, does this mean that the only humans who have a shot at the Sublime are those who have visited a Delos park? So you're only going to test the assholes? Yikes.
Yeah, I thought the same thing. So who are you repopulating the Sublime with? Because you're not going to let William in there. You're not going to let people who are dicks in there. So I don't know.
And what a missed opportunity during all this mayhem and carnage to show us the human toll of it, the human response to it, right? It's New York City. It's millions of people. It's descending into mayhem and everybody's killing each other. And you just have bodies organized very neatly in the streets. But what are the people that are cowering in their homes? What are the people who are, seeing this all fall apart? What about those outliers who never got out? I mean, there was so much opportunity to show the human emotion behind it. I feel like I was watching a Transformers movie where entire skyscrapers are coming down, but nobody cares because you don't feel anything for any of the people. So let us know what you think. Are there any other loose ends that we missed, or do you have any explanations for these loose ends? What happens to surviving hosts? Why Maeve was important? What happened to the cause? Why was Frankie scanned, or anything else? Go ahead and write us, hosts@shatontv.com, or leave us a voicemail, chatpod.com/TV, using the SpeakPipe feature. And finally, let's get on to the odds and ends. Just a couple of items that didn't fit nicely into any of the other categories. We found out in this episode, in case it wasn't clear, that Christina did create Maya, Peter, her boss, Teddy, and other people with whom she interacted. And the reason why they would interact with her and others in the world is because she can impact humans, right? So she, through that digital interface, is able to impact the real world. So people who are pointing out that Maya was talking to a bartender, Christina conjures Maya. The bartender sees Maya because that augmented reality is real through the tones that are being put out by the tower. One fun thing we saw in this episode was Craddock was back. If you remember him, he was a Confederado and a Generation 1 host. So it was cool to see him back. I do like that they're bringing back some of these characters. I wish they'd done more with it, but the cameos are nice. And my biggest laugh of the episode was when we visited the drugstore. I'm glad the drugstores are still organized by aisle. But guys, it's 2080. We see that they've got laser healing wands. The drugstore, it's still a drugstore out of the 80s. It's got sutures and hydrogen peroxide. I was also intrigued by the fact that during this mayhem, this carnage, everyone in New York City killing each other, people decided to loot the dog section of the drugstore, which is what I would do. I'd go for dog toys and treats first.
I got to tell you, as someone who survived Hurricane Katrina, people loot the weirdest shit. It's like when they open the doors, they're like, oh, well, I obviously need this. I need all of the cases of Bengay that have ever existed, because that's what went first. We went into a store in a Walmart, and I just remember walking up and all of the diabetic supplies were gone, which made sense. All of the cold medicines were gone, which, get high. And then all of the Bengay was gone, like just like a whole wall of it. And it was like, but why? Everybody's sore after a storm.
I think once you fucked a person who has Bengay on their body, you can never go back. It's an essential.
Yeah. Well, and you also, I feel like you smell like it for the rest of your life. Like their scent is on you forever because Bengay doesn't go away.
Also, that light blue extra sugar-free gum tastes exactly like Bengay. And
it does.
Now that you've heard that, you'll never get it out of your
mind.
I
will never get that out of my head. Fuck you, Gene Lyons.
You're not the only person saying that this week. And finally, why did Bernard leave the door open? Was it for host to get in, host to get out? It was for Hale to put in Christina's pearl.
But couldn't he have just given her the code? Did he have to leave it open?
Yeah.
Reach to your left and tacked on a Post-it note on the side of the gun I left you is the code.
Maybe it was like a very long code and it would have been really hard to communicate it.
She's a host. She would have he could have put a QR code that she could have scanned with her host eyes, And
if you aren't planning on listening to Telegraph, please do, because people have tons of questions like this, many of which can just be answered by Bernard saw the way things are supposed to go and he had to do them in an exact way because that's the way the Sublime told him to. But man, that gives you a lot of license for a TV show. I don't know if that's fair for writers. And speaking of the Telegraph, that's the next time we'll see you guys. So go ahead and get your messages in for us. We really, really appreciate you listening, sticking with us even after the season has wrapped. That's it for this edition and season of the Westworld Deep Dive. Be sure to follow us on social media and share with a friend. We're on Twitter, Snapchat, and Instagram at Shat on TV. On Facebook, just search for Shat on TV Podcast. The website is shatpod.com/TV. You can email us, host@shatontv.com. Wherever fine podcasts can be found, including Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Pandora, Spotify, and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe. And if you stop by Apple Podcasts, please be sure to leave a 5-star review that helps the podcast grow. Also, do not miss our Westie Awards. That is our live presentation with such categories as Best Hero, Best Villain, Best Death. You can vote on those live with us on Twitch. That'll be on Monday, August 22nd at 9 p.m. Eastern. It doesn't cost anything. You can use the Twitch app or just go to shatpod.com/Twitch and join us there. We'd really love to have you. On behalf of my co-hosts, Ash and Big D, I'm Gene Lyons. Be sure to join us Friday for the Westworld Telegraph.